Welcome to our GW Law Summer Series 2023 on reforming the ABA Model Procurement Code. I'm Chris Yukins, a professor in the Government Procurement Law program at George Washington University Law School. And this year's annual summer series will focus on potential updates to the ABA Model Procurement Code for state and local governments. The Model Procurement Code, or the MPC, was last updated in 2000, and volunteers and staff from leading organizations such as the American Bar Association, the National Association of State Procurement Officials, or NAFPO, and NIGP, the Institute for Public Procurement, joined by lawyers and officials from every part of the country, are embarking on an ambitious update of the code. The summer series will span 4 evenings in July and will provide an in-depth look at cutting-edge issues in procurement law across the United States. The online sessions will run from 6 to 8 p.m. on each of the session nights. Tonight, we'll have an introduction to the Model Procurement Code, discussions of the need for reform. We have a special guest, Dixon Robertson, who serves as a reporter to the MPC Reform Initiative. We'll be talking about him in just a second. On July 20th, this Thursday, we're going to have a discussion of understanding the OMB Uniform Grants Guidance with our special guest, Scott Scheffler from Felsman Tucker, Washington, D.C. He'll be talking about the OMB Grants Guidance that is likely to serve as a focal point of the reform effort of the MPC. On Tuesday, July 25th, we're going to have a session on updating the 2000 MPC to meet the current OMB Grants Guidance. We'll be talking about that today, and then in more detail next Tuesday, a week from today. We have a special guest, Yolanda Williams. She'll be joining us. Yolanda is an Army officer. She's in training. She's a recent LLM student at GW. She'll be joining us for the second hour. I'll cover the first hour next Tuesday. On July 27th, which is a week from this Thursday, we'll be looking beyond the OMB Grants Guidance. We'll be focusing on cybersecurity issues. We'll be joined by my research assistants, Brandon Hancock and Jacob Berkowitz. We'll be talking about cybersecurity measures that have been undertaken by state and local governments across the United States. And we'll be talking about the potential state ramp alternative as a means of achieving cybersecurity in state procurement. The resources from these programs are available on the program page at publicprocurementinternational.com. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dixon Robertson, our special guest for this evening. Dixon serves as an Assistant General Counsel for the South Carolina State Fiscal Accountability Authority. He represents South Carolina's Chief Procurement Officers for Supplies and Services, Information Technology, and Construction. Prior to that, he was a trial attorney handling primarily construction matters. He's extremely well qualified to serve as a reporter on this MPC reform project. We're very grateful he could join this evening's program. Welcome, Dixon. So we're going to be working our way through slides explaining both the MPC reform effort, and we'll also be discussing some of the potential areas of reform, drawing in part on papers that have been written over the years on MPC reform, partly within our program as well. Our program information on our program is available on our GW website on Beyond the FAR if you're interested in learning more about our government procurement law program at GW. If you have questions this evening, please use the Q&A function, and we'll be monitoring that. We'll be monitoring the chat as well. And if you have questions that you'd like to follow up with, please feel free to send emails. We'll be sharing that contact information at the end of the session. As I said, these are the 4 sessions. This evening, then this Thursday, and then the following Tuesday and Thursday. It gives you an outline. This is a schedule of what we'll be going through. The idea is actually relatively simple, which is this evening to give an introduction to the reform effort. And then because the initial reform effort is likely to focus on guidance issued by the Office of Management and Budget in the White House for federal grantees, this Thursday, Scott Scheffler, who's an expert on federal grants, he'll be talking about that grants guidance in more detail, and we'll introduce it this evening so that we know what it is that the Model Procurement Code would have to be updated to meet. And then on next Tuesday, a week from today, Yolanda Williams and I will be talking in more detail about how that gap might be filled between the current Model Procurement Code and the OMB guidance. And then a week from this Thursday, we'll be discussing, as I noted, the cybersecurity issues and other potential areas of reform beyond the OMB guidance. So the core of the MPC reform effort is really lodged in the ABA Public Contract Law section and the MPC Committee within the ABA public contract law section. That's a starting point with very important input as well from other organizations around the country. The ones I mentioned, I'll be discussing those in more detail. The ABA is really served as the driver behind the MPC over many years, and I'll go through that history with you here. So the original idea behind the Model Procurement Code in the 1970s was there was a great deal there are many requirements put by the Office of Management and Budget at the White House on federal grantees with regards to the procurement that they do with federal grants funds. Those requirements were extensive in the 1970s. And the idea behind the MPC, in part, besides giving state and local governments a good tool for building their own procurement laws, the idea in part was to make it easier for federal grantees to use this uniform law as a way of ensuring that their procurement rules were in accordance with the federal requirements from the Office of Management and Budget. So you can see the core role that the federal grants guidance plays in driving the MPC. During the Reagan administration, a lot of those requirements were taken away as part of the Reagan administration's move towards a federalism, a deference to the states. So in the MPC was less critical during the Reagan administration, but over the years, the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, has issued more and more procurement guidance to federal grantees. And so having a benchmark law that could be used by grantees to ensure that their procurement being done under federal grants is in fact conforming to the OMB guidance, it becomes more and more important over time. The most recent update of the Model Procurement Code was done in 2000, and there are also accompanying proposed regulations or draft regulations that go with it. And then as well, in 2007, there was a Public Infrastructure Procurement Code published as a condensation of the Model Procurement Code. That 2007 code drew on the Model Procurement Code and really focuses on public infrastructure, on construction. These materials, by the way, are also all available on my website, the publicprocurementinternational.com. Put them all together. Sometimes it's difficult to access materials that, for example, if the ABA website changes. So I have the materials with permission of the section. I have the materials gathered on publicprocurementinternational.com. So this text is from the 2000 code, and the ABA public contract law section and the ABA state and local section are very proud of what the MPC has been able to accomplish over the years. The MPC, the 2000 version, notes that since 1979, the Model Procurement Code has been adopted in full by 17 states and in part by several more. By the way, if you go to the Model Procurement Code resources on Public Procurement International, you'll see there a compilation done by Keith McCook, who works with Dixon in South Carolina, a compilation that he's done of states that have adopted or adapted the Model Procurement Code for their own purposes. And by thousands, it's also been used by thousands of local jurisdictions across the United States. As the ABA pointed out in the 2000 version, the Model Procurement Code is one of the most successful projects ever conducted by the section of public contract law and the section of state and local government law. And it's had a profound and favorable impact on the conduct of public procurement throughout the United States since 1979. So it's a very important project, the ABA. We'll be talking today about various reform initiatives. I want to make very clear up front, there's been no decision within the ABA or the other stakeholder organizations about how this reform would unfold. This is really this summer series is about possible areas of reform, potential areas of reform based on scholarship that's been done over the years. NASPO, the National Association of State Purchasing Officials, has also been very supportive of the ABA Model Procurement Code. NASPO supports implementing the 2000 American Bar Association Model Procurement Code's provisions into state procurement laws. NASPO pointed out that 60% of the jurisdictions that responded to a NASPO survey indicated they had adopted the provisions of the Model Code partially or in its entirety. Of these states, NASPO said the majority implemented all provisions of the 2000 Model Code or modeled their procurement codes after it. So NASPO has been tracking and is very supportive of the implementation of the MPC around the country. What I'd like to do is just briefly go through with you how the 2000 revision process worked, the revision process that ended in 2000, it culminated in the 2000 version, the current version of the ABA Model Procurement Code. And I'll turn it over to Dixon to talk a little bit about what's happening, as he's a reporter helping lead the current initiative to reform the Model Procurement Code. In leading up to the 2000 reforms, the NIGP and NASPO helped trigger it by asking for a review. And then the ABA Public Contract Law section and the ABA State and Local Government section took the lead in driving forward the reform that culminated in the 2000 version. John Miller was a reporter on the Public Contract Law section side, and Maggie McConnell was a reporter on the state and local side. The reporters proposed revised text, and that went to review by the councils in the Public Contract Law section and the state and local section. And then there was a steering committee reconciliation between the various proposed reforms, and that resulted in final revised text that was approved by the ABA House of Delegates. The leadership of both sections played an ongoing important role, including the steering committee with Tom Madden, Craig Ottmer, Larry Etheridge, and Charles Olson. This was very much a document or a review or revision in 2000 that reflected consensus and a lot of deliberation within these various components of the ABA. And that's really an important hallmark of the Model Procurement Code. It reflects consensus. It reflects a careful way forward. Now, Dixon, if you want to take a couple minutes and talk a little bit about where we're going with the current reform initiative.
Sure, Chris, thank you. The organization is not that much different from what it was in 2000. We've moved the steering committee up, and so the councils of the two sections have created create a steering committee. The reporters, there are three of us. We answer to the steering committee. We have an advisory committee, which is composed of representatives of NASPO, NIGP, various stakeholder organizations and trade organizations, so that vendors have some representation in this process as well. They will communicate with the reporters through a liaison, so that we're not trying to answer to hundreds of different people. We will have an academic advisor, who is Chris, and also a federal procurement advisor who has not yet been identified, but they will provide a resource for the reporters and also for the drafting committees. The drafting committees are where the real work is going to be done. We have not yet formed any of them. That's part of what we're doing today, is a little bit of outreach and trying to drum up some interest so that we can recruit people for the drafting committees. One of the key provisions in the governance plan is that every drafting committee has to have at least one representative who is a procurement official, whether that's with the local government or state government. We don't want this to be a bunch of lawyers telling state procurement staff how they need to buy stuff. There are three phases that that we have planned. The first one is a survey phase, which is outreach to identify folks who will serve on the drafting committees. We hope to have, in addition to this forum, other town halls where we, as I said, we identify folks who can serve on the drafting committees, and we develop ultimately a catalog of necessary or desired areas where all of the people that we have reached out to believe the model code could stand a little revision. The second phase is initial revisions, which again, almost all of that work will be done at the drafting committee level. We will publish it for public review. And if there are any changes that need to be made because of the public review, we'll make those changes and again publish it for for public comment. Following that, there will be a review by the steering committee. I believe, although it's not quite clear, that the steering committee will get input from the section councils on the initial revisions. And then we'll enter the last phase, which is the final revisions, which will incorporate any comments from the sections, incorporate any guidance from the steering committee. And following this final revision, we hope that through the steering committee, we will obtain approval by the section councils, by the sections themselves, and then ultimately by big ABA, by the ABA House of Delegates. And we'll publish a new version of the model code.
Dixon, will the process be outlined in a document that others can see?
Yes. In fact, it is, except that others can't see it quite yet. There's some political machinations that I don't fully understand going on. And I think that once we are past the ABA's convention in August, then all of these documents will be available. We worked very hard to get a written governance plan. And we were a little dismayed that now that we have it, we can't let anybody see it. But yes, ultimately it will be public.
And will there be a website that people will be able to look to see the materials published?
Yes. Again, because of factors that I don't fully understand, we don't have that yet. But I am hopeful that early this fall, yes, we'll have a website, we'll have these documents posted. The governance plan itself refers to a number of reference documents, one of which is a 2017 resolution by the two sections that called for a revision effort and sets out some core principles to be followed during the revisions. It's an excellent document, but you're not going to find it on ABA's website. At least I couldn't find it on ABA's website. It will be on our website once we have one.
And so in the interim, just for the audience, and we have over 100 folks signed up for this session. We're creating a record that'll be available on the publicprocurement.com, publicprocurementinternational.com website, and also these webinar sessions will be available through the YouTube page for the GW Law Government Procurement Law Program. And the materials that are compiled there are hopefully useful research materials until there can be a website set up for the formal effort the formal initiative for reform. We're really just serving as a backstop until those materials can be published through the initiative. So thank you very much, Dixon. So as I mentioned, the 2000 version, which is the current version of the Model Procurement Code, was published before the OMB guidance for federal grantees was really dramatically revised in 2013, 2014. And by the way, if you want to see guidance from one of the granting agencies, for example, the Department of Justice, it's available on the program page for this evening's program. You can see how they've implemented the requirements regarding procurement that's done by their grantees. It starts at about page 50 of that guide. So there are very significant requirements in the OMB guidance for, especially for entities below the state level. The states are given a fair amount of deference, as Scott Scheffler will be discussing on Thursday. The states themselves as grantees are given substantial deference when they're using federal funds to make procurement. They're allowed to use their own procedures. But what are referred to as the non-federal entities, or the NFEs, the non-federal entities, as Scott will be explaining, are very significant procurement guidelines that they need to follow. And so the goal would be to update the 2000 version of the Model Procurement Code to reflect the current guidance from the Office of Management and Budget, so that grantees will be confident that when they're procuring, if they've adopted the Model Procurement Code or adopted relevant portions of the Model Procurement Code, that they're conforming to the OMB requirements. The OMB requirements are published in Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations. And then those are implemented, that the OMP guidance is implemented by the individual grantee agencies, such as the Department of Justice, which makes extensive grants for law enforcement purposes. So you can look at the grants rules and the individual grants, individual granting agency, or you can, as a starting point, you could look at the OMB guidance, and the OMB guidance, which again is at 2 CFR, Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations. It's also available on our resource page for this evening's program. And you see from this list that there are really significant issues that have to be addressed. There have to be codes of conduct in place. An open question we're discussing this evening is about whether or not the Model Procurement Code should take a step beyond that and say, okay, if you have code of conduct, you should also have compliance systems, because that's a logical follow-on to having a code of conduct, that you also have a compliance system. We'll be talking about where those standards might be derived from. Intergovernmental purchases are recommended under the OMB guidance, and that's very important for stakeholders in this reform process. NASPO, as many of you know, NASPO is a sponsor of the NASPO Value Point contracts, which are used by state and local governments all over the United States on an intergovernmental basis. So the OMB guidance endorses that. There are constraints on time and materials contracting, and that because time and materials contracting can be derived from IDIQ, or indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts, which we'll be talking more about. That's an issue that has to be addressed and thought through in the Model Procurement Code. There are under the grants, the grantees are responsible for source evaluation, protest, disputes, and claims. Does that mean, one of the issues that we'll be discussing is, does that mean that grantees should have protest systems? The protest rules are pretty well articulated in the 2000 version of the Model Procurement Code. They could be updated slightly because there have been some changes since 2000 with regards to bid protest and bid protest practice around the United States. But is the guidance really a signal that there should be a protest? Because some states don't have protest systems in place. Some of these issues that are in the gray area, this is why Dixon is a reporter and I'm not. It's because he's a much better person than I am. And so these issues that are in the gray area, and you can see this in the 2000 version as well. And I worked on the UN Model Procurement Law for 10 years. There are actually two documents running in parallel. One is the statutory text, and the other is the reporter's notes. In the UN Model Procurement Code, the UN, the United Nations Model Procurement Code, has a 350 or so page guide to enactment that goes with it. And a lot of these gray area policy issues, like should states be encouraged to have, or should non-federal entities below the state level that are receiving federal grants monies, should they be encouraged to have protest systems in place under the grants guidance? Those are issues that could be addressed in the reporter's notes, and those gray area policy issues were addressed in the 2000 version as well. For example, in several places you can see statements or positions that were taken by NASPO, the National Association of State Purchasing Officials. You can see them in the notes to the 2000 version. So you can see these policy dialogues going on in the reporter's notes, even if there couldn't be consensus on an actual change to the code itself. The guidance from OMB calls for full and open competition. That's a pretty demanding standard under federal law. So how does that play out, and how do we make sure that it plays out successfully in the Model Procurement Code? There's a call to micro purchases and simplified acquisitions. One of the open issues that the federal government is struggling with right now is whether or not to use services like Amazon, and other online platforms as a means of doing simplified acquisitions. In the federal government, Amazon can be used for purchases up to $10,000. You can also use Overstock.com or Christian Scientific. The General Services Administration has those vehicles in place. But if state or local governments go that way, and some states are considering the use of Amazon, if you go that way, essentially you're bypassing the entire procurement function. and you're letting users go directly to an online platform. That creates a lot of interesting questions and problems. And those are things that we'll be thinking about as we go through the MPC reform. There's a call in the OMB guidance for affirmative steps to promote women and minority-owned businesses. In the wake of the recent Supreme Court decision regarding affirmative action at University of North Carolina and at Harvard, the strict scrutiny applied by the court, there's going to be an open question in what approach the MPC might take. This ultimately was a question, to use the example from the UN Model Procurement Law. This issue at the international level was extremely divisive because different nations wanted to be able to take different approaches to socioeconomic programs. And the way that it was ultimately resolved at the UN level, ironically, is exactly the same way that GAO has resolved it, which is to say that take a hands-off approach as to what kind of socioeconomic programs might be used, but just to say that whatever socioeconomic preferences might be put into a particular procurement, they have to be grounded in a statute or regulation. They have to reflect a democratic or an open governance process that generates those preferences. What those preferences actually are left under the UN model law, they're left to the individual nation to decide. There's a preference for U.S. goods that's built into the OMB guidance, and how that might be implemented through the Model Procurement Code is an open question. Because many of the states have their own preferences, and there's a complex system of sometimes reciprocal deference among the states, if states have individual by-state preferences, to overlay that with a Buy American preference could be very complicated. It's also complicated by the fact that the NASPO value point contracts are in effect a pathway into state procurement markets for foreign vendors. There are foreign vendors who are already on the NASPO value point contracts. It's a pathway in, and a pathway that arguably reflects the commitment of the states under free trade agreements like the government procurement agreement to open up their markets to foreign vendors. So this issue is already unfolding, and to put the Buy American preference that the OMB guidance anticipates, to put that on top, it's going to be a complicated piece of the puzzle to work through. The OMB guidance calls for federal agencies' review of purchasing systems. This is very similar to what the World Bank does in its review of procurement systems among borrowers using the World Bank procurement framework. It's a bonding requirement, and a bonding requirement is actually relatively rare at this point in federal procurement, and internationally, it's relatively rare for there to be payment of performance bonds outside the construction sphere. So working out how this might be implemented through the Model Procurement Code is an open issue. And then there are various clauses that are called for, including the federal government has taken a very hard line on Huawei as a vendor because of concerns that Huawei may in fact be the source of espionage, that the Chinese government, the People's Republic, may be using Huawei as a means of spying. And so the federal government had banned, for the most part, had banned Huawei products. And the question is whether or not how the states and the non-federal entities implementing the OMB guidance could do so with recognizing things like the Huawei ban. Okay, so our session, as I said, on our third session next week, will be discussion of the gap analysis between the difference between the Model Procurement Code of 2000 and the current OMB guidance. Yolanda Williams will be joining me in that. Yolanda, as I said, she's a U.S. Army officer. She's in training, so she'll only be able to join us for the second hour that evening. Then, as now, this evening we'll be going until 7 o'clock, and then we're going to take a 10-minute break and then come back until 8 p.m. Eastern. So this is a gap analysis that in a very rough way outlines what the OMB guidance calls for and where there might be some potential revisions of the Model Procurement Code to bring the Model Procurement Code up to speed with what the OMB guidance calls for. Dixon, did you find this gap analysis useful in preparing a proposed line of attack on the MPC reform?
It was invaluable. We used the gap analysis to identify how we were going to distribute the work among the various drafting committees. And so what we tried to do was to look at the gap analysis and how it creates a crosswalk between the OMB guidance and the various articles of the model code. You know, I was thinking this afternoon, the OMB could have made this much easier if they'd simply followed the article numbering protocol that the model code uses, but they didn't do that. And of course, my state is a model code jurisdiction, but our article numbers have only a tenuous relationship with the ones that the drafters of the model code used. And the only reason I can think of is because South Carolina, remember, we started a war without a cannonball factory, but here we are. What we did using the crosswalk, or treating the gap analysis as a crosswalk, we created, I think, 8 different drafting committees. The first one is a general committee, and it combines articles 1, 2, 7, and 8 of the model code. That's general provisions, procurement organization, cost principles, and supply management. We have a dedicated committee to focus on Article 3, which is source selection and contract formation. We have a committee that is going to deal with Articles 4 and 6. Article 4 is specifications. Article 6 is modification and termination of contracts for supplies and services. We plan to have an Article 5 drafting committee. Article 5 is the construction article, procurement of infrastructure, facilities, and services. An Article 9 committee for legal and contractual remedies. This would deal with the protest issues that Chris was talking about a little while ago. Article 10 deals with intergovernmental relations, and this would address things like cooperative purchasing, like the intergovernmental arrangements that are treated in the OMB guidance, and also some of the issues that exist with those arrangements. You know, there's sort of wide open, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts with no requirement for any secondary competition. And so I would expect that as we address some of the cooperative purchasing issues, that we may weave in some other provisions that specifically address IDIQ contracting. Article 11 is assistance to small and disadvantaged businesses. Obviously, there's a great deal of language that focuses on that in the OMB guidance. Depending on your state, there may be little or no substance to Article 11, or it may be very fulsome. And finally, Article 12 is ethics in public contracting. In South Carolina, we have a separate ethics act that governs state employees. I'm very interested for Chris to get to this notion of contractor code of conduct, because it's something that we're wrestling with right now in South Carolina. We try to bind them contractually to certain ethical rules, but there's a lot of difference between telling somebody he may go to jail if he gives a contract to his buddy, and telling a contractor that if you don't play nice, then we might not deal with you in the future.
So I want to ask you a couple of questions based on your experience at the well, first of all, where did they get the cannonballs when they were firing at Fort Sumter? In terms of the small and disadvantaged entities, so at Camp Dixon there was a report this afternoon. The Republican attorney generals have said that they're going to very closely review any race-based preferences in contracting. Do you think that'll affect the drafting process under that political issue, that ongoing political issue regarding race-based preferences will affect the review in which you've identified as the 7th committee?
in South Carolina, under our procurement code, there is an assistance to small and minority business organizations section, but it is essentially a mandate to gather information without any direction as to what we're supposed to do with that information once we've gathered it. Now, our DOT, Transportation Department, they're under a completely different regime, except for other than highway maintenance, construction, and repair. They're not really governed by the procurement code. They're governed by whatever Federal Highway Administration rules and those funding rules. And they do have certain preferences. They do have, I believe, some set asides for small businesses, small and disadvantaged businesses. But again, that's not part of our procurement code. That's part of DOT's whatever conditions there are on the federal highway construction monies that come their way. If I can assure you that if there is a move afoot amongst Republican attorneys general, our Republican attorney general will be in the front row.
So one of the ways that that the Europeans have thought about this issue, Dixon, is to split. And if you look historically at our small business, our small business regime at the federal level, it reflects this. But it really took Europeans to say, "Hey, this is how you understand your own history." They point out that you can take small business programs and let's move just. I'm just moving away. I'm talking more generically about small business issues, not here about race-based preferences. But they say there's actually two separate things you could do. One is to facilitate the involvement of small businesses, and the other is to create preferences. And if you look at the Small Business Act passed early in the 50s in the Eisenhower administration, the Small Business Act was originally first a facilitation act. And only later in the 50s and the 60s, in response to really a lot of civil unrest, then you start seeing preferences built into the Small Business Act. Is it possible that one way to go forward on this, Dixon, in the Model Procurement Code is to say, look, there's a lot of political uncertainty surrounding race-based preferences, in fact, surrounding potentially gender-based preferences as well. What we want to talk about is facilitation. We want to make it easier for small businesses of all kinds to participate in public procurement. It's to focus on facilitation in order to steer around some of the political sensitivities.
I'm not exactly sure what you're asking me. You know, I don't get to act on whatever preferences, see what I did there, whatever my own personal predilections might be. I can tell you that we use other policies to make it easier for smaller businesses to participate in selling services and supplies to the state government. For example, we train public buyers not to bundle services unnecessarily. We train them to structure the term of contracts so that small businesses can afford to participate by amortizing costs over a longer term instead of having to come up with a bunch of costs and not knowing whether they will be on the contract for more than a year. So we do things that are not mandatory. They're not dictated by the statute, but we hope that they have the effect of providing entry to business organizations that might not otherwise be able to participate.
Yeah, I did I worked with the government in Kyrgyzstan on they were trying to implement reforms in this area, and they started down the path, and I said, look, you have a choice between facilitation and preferences. And they actually had a civil war in the 1990s between the Uzbeks and the Kyrgyz. There are two major ethnic groups in Kyrgyzstan. And I said, if you create preferences, it's very possible that you're going to favor one ethnic group or the other, and you're going to create the kind of internal division that led to the Civil War. I said, you can take the approach that the European Commission has taken, which is they have, ironically, they stole our idea. The European Commission calls it the Small Business Act, and it's a list of facilitation approaches, almost exactly what you've been talking about, things like anti-bundling provisions. And that list of facilitation provisions became a checklist for the Kirkis as they were trying to figure out ways to make their small business programs work better.
Now, we do have a preference statute in South Carolina for South Carolina contractors, South Carolina agricultural products, something else, but it's limited to, I believe, purchases under $150,000, and it doesn't apply to anything where there are evaluation factors for award other than price. So if you issue an RFP, there are no preferences. If you're buying something for $500,000, there are no preferences.
One of the interesting things that we'll be dealing with in that regard is if the MPC in the MPC reform process, there's a desire to open up a allowance for things like Amazon. What we call colloquially Amazon.gov, the idea that Amazon would enter into arrangement with South Carolina or with some other state, as it has with the federal government, so that purchasers can buy at the micro purchase level, the small purchase level. What's been kind of interesting, Dixon, watching, and we talk about this a lot in our classes because we have students who are military officers who use this system. And what's happened is that while technically speaking, the federal government has cut loose and has allowed these users just using their normal government credit cards to make purchases off Amazon, they've carried with it the same normal procurement requirements. So principles or rules, like for instance, rules regarding accessibility for persons with disabilities, those rules still have to be followed even at the micro purchase level. So in order to use these vehicles, sometimes a user, a close friend of mine, Dan Shaney, he's a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, he wanted to buy a printer, a $400 printer. He had to take 5 courses to buy a $400 printer because essentially we're taking the entire procurement system and we're putting it inside the brain of the user saying, okay, we're not going to formally impose these requirements, but you have to know what the requirements are inside your head before you go in. You're not a procurement officer, but we're going to make you a mini procurement officer by training you in all these things. And that training, that goes into it itself makes the system so very cumbersome. Ironically, the thought was that there might be 6 billion dollars were projected in the first year, Dixon, for Amazon.gov, and they only had 6 million. 6 billion projected, they only had 6 million. But any other situation in Amazon world, Jeff Bezos would say, you're roadkill. But in the government, it's a success. And so they're rolling forward. And so the Amazon experiment is still going on, and we can draw on it in the MPC reform process, draw on it and learn from some of the problems. One of the major problems has been the problem of how you deal with cybersecurity issues, because if users can purchase technology like Huawei and there's a perceived threat from Huawei, that's potentially a problem. So we got a question from Keith McCook. Keith asked, do you know Keith McCook by chance, Dixon?
I think he's my boss, actually.
So Keith McCook asked, he said, sounds like we need stripped down and simplified rules for commercial products, which is what we have under FAR Part 12 at the federal level. Do you think that the MPC, the Model Procurement Code, Dixon, might be modified to create a special set of provisions regarding commercial products? Or is that just not necessary at the state or local level because most of the purchases being done are commercial anyway?
Well, I wish the last part of your statement were true. I'm not so sure that we are not still trying to buy bespoke items when certainly a COTS item and certainly a commercial item and probably a COTS item would serve just as well. But we overhauled our version of the model code 4 years ago in 2019. You know, I always have to smile when you talk about federal micro purchases and federal simplified acquisition procedures, because their limits are a little bit different than ours. But one of the things that we did in 2019 is that we raised the limits on small purchases, so that we can now buy we can spend up to $10,000 on the purchasers, the procurement officers certification that the price is fair and reasonable. We can spend up to $50,000 if we get 3 quotes. And we can spend up to $100,000 to buy cots if we get 3 quotes. And although we don't have any hard data, the anecdotal evidence that we have is that people are crazy about this. They say that it's one of the best things that we've ever done for buyers, because we've made their lives easier when it comes to buying just everyday stuff that you see in a Walmart.
And I want to pull out a strand on that if I could, Dixon, because it gets kind of lost at the federal level. In the DoD goes through very, very extensive machinations. But once they've identified a product as being commercial, not COTS, but being commercial in nature, that it forever after will be learned. So it's almost like it's almost like a medieval inquiry. Is this person a Lutheran or is this person a Catholic? And as opposed to saying, well, the real purpose of this is the reason that we would allow a higher threshold for COTS is because there are market forces working on COTS. So in your practical experience in South Carolina, is that true, that we are essentially allowing the market to sort out the price reasonableness?
Chris, you and I had a discussion a couple of years ago, or maybe it was last year, in the context of debarment proceedings, where I pointed out that it's all fine and good to say we need to enforce debarment, but where are the resources? Who's going to try the debarment case? And we have the same. We have, if you read about staffing shortages and training deficits and you know, the lack of skilled acquisition personnel at the federal level, magnify it exponentially, and that's what you find at the state level. And I can only imagine what it is like at the local level. The result, one of the results is we're supposed to only award a contract if the price is reasonable, but that's perfunctory. We don't do any price analysis. We don't have the expertise to do it. We don't have the resources. We don't have what's DOD's. DOD has an entire bureau set up to provide cost and pricing assistance. We don't have any of that. And so I had an epiphany a couple of years ago that until we start doing that, that we're not going to get the code to work the way that we want it to. Circling back to your question, one of the things that we're struggling with now is this massive indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contract for IT services. Well, if I could say only buy IT services that are commercial items, then I might feel a little more comfortable, since they're supposed to be, the pricing is supposed to be verifiable from sources other than the vendor. But I can't do that, because that's not the way that we buy those services. We buy them, basically, we issue a statement of work and we get what's a time and materials fixed price. And nobody at the agency level, even the technology agencies, really conduct any meaningful analysis of whether that price, you know, this many hours of these different positions at these rates, whether the total is reasonable. And so it's very difficult until you move to COTS for our folks to say, I am convinced that this is a fair and reasonable price, because they either can't or they don't.
But I'm really glad you raised this, because I think that as someone who's worked in Washington for many years, I floundered for many years, Dixon, trying to figure out what do I need to know in order to be effective in helping state and local governments in reviewing procurement. And you really put your finger on what I think is a central issue. The issue is one of resources. Natalie, who's Natalie Wright, is one of our co-reporters. Natalie is a procurement attorney for Cook County. Cook County's population would make Cook County, South Carolina is the 25th state, Cook County would be the 26th state. Okay, it's just below South Carolina in terms of population. And so we asked Natalie, we said, how many procurement lawyers do you have in what would be the 26th state? And she said, one. I'm the only one. And that was just so different from the federal experience. In a federal agency of that size, you could, like the DoD has hundreds of procurement lawyers. So that lack of capacity really, really shapes how we approach things like revising the model procurement. So, for example, the OMB guidance anticipates, you see in the bottom row here, anticipates standard clauses like termination for convenience. I've been astounded to find out that in some state situations, a state agency will terminate for convenience rather than default. Contractor screws up, agency, instead of terminating for default, will terminate for convenience, just to avoid the transaction costs of going through a termination for default proceeding. They'll terminate for convenience. And then termination for convenience in that world carries a certain stigma, because everybody knows that you might be terminated for convenience for poor performance. But in that light, Dixon, you have decades of experience working with these kinds of clauses in the construction field. Do you think that it's a fool's errand to try and emphasize standard clauses, or do you think standard clauses make sense and they might just be used in different ways depending on state or local resources?
Well, I'd suggest, Chris, that it may be even worse than what you think. I suspect that when we issue a contract for a 2-year term with 3 1-year renewals, we're not even getting a termination for convenience in those things. They simply non-renew. And so no one knows outside of the agency that received the poor service. No one else in state government knows that that contractor is not responsible or has failed to perform satisfactorily on another contract, because the only thing that we see is, oh, well, the contract was non-renewed after 2 years or after 3 years, and now we've got to resolicit the thing. So we have terminated contracts, but I don't know that I've ever seen a termination, whether convenience or default, where a lawyer has not gotten involved. Right? I mean, I don't know that I've ever seen a procurement officer on her own initiative say, enough, you're fired. We just don't see it. And again, it's resource driven more than anything else. It's certainly not that all of our contractors here in South Carolina are perfectly confident and do a great job.
So let me ask a related question, and this is something we're dealing with at the federal level and also trying to deal with this internationally. It's a related question, Dixon, of access to contractor qualification information, access to the information that you would use, that a contracting official would use in making a responsibility determination, making a qualification determination. So for example, and when I talk to my foreign colleagues about this drives them bananas. They say, well, how do we find out if contractor X has been debarred? I said, that's very easy. You go to sam.gov and then you just find the contractor. And then of course, you have to find the reps and certs. And then of course, there are 2 reps and certs, you have to go to the right button. And then when you click on the right button, you have to know, of course you should know this, it's 52.209-5, but sometimes it's -7. And in a lot of cases it's -9, but eventually you'll find this. And they say, oh my God, this is incredible. I say, well, if you're a 60-year-old procurement lawyer, it's easy. And they say, no, well, this is impossible. So one of the things that they're talking about, we're going to have a webinar on this on September 12th with folks from the European Commission who are very engaged in opening up lines of trade. The European Commission folks and our European counterparts are talking about setting up responsibility or qualification information so it's very accessible, so that it can be easily read across borders. Do you think that that there's going to be any support in the MPC revision process for setting out the types of qualification information that state or local governments should make readily publicly available so that other state and local governments can borrow that information?
I don't know about the MPC revision effort. What I can tell you is it has been a titanic struggle for us, Keith, myself. We now have 3.5 lawyers who do procurement at our agency, but simply to require evaluation of past performance. You must evaluate past performance in every acquisition. And that has been, no, you're kidding. We can't do that. We have, historically, we've always required references, and sometimes they're checked, sometimes they're not. But to require a meaningful evaluation of past performance for at least for any acquisition above a certain threshold, I think it's just a bare minimum. But it's been a challenge to get some of our folks to acknowledge, well, yeah, that might be a good idea. I might want to know how he's done on his last 5 janitorial contracts, none of which were renewed after the first year.
So that's the last question I want to touch on before our break here, Dixon, which you can see here in this draft gap analysis, we start moving to it. So in the states and most local governments, you're in what I would call the 20th century FOIA world, the Freedom of Information Act world, where information has to be presented on demand. It can be withheld under certain criteria, but the idea is an episodic demand from usually someone has to be a taxpayer in this, or has to be a citizen of the state in order to demand the information. And so it's an episodic demand and then a response by the state or local government under the FOIA paradigm. You see here in terms of the guidance here under section 200.325, the idea is that you also have scrutiny from the federal grants giving agency. But they really haven't turned the corner, Dixon, to what I think is a 21st century approach, which is open data, which is that all the procurement data would be available presumptively all the time, except where it's confidential, where it's truly confidential. So presumptively, everything's visible all the time. And there are examples around the world where governments have made everything open all the time. Ukraine before the war was famous for in the Prozoro system. We're trying to make everything open all the time. Do you think that state and local governments could move, because that would solve the problem, Dixon, of these past performance evaluations, for example. If you have reports being or records being generated in the normal course or during during a construction project, for example, if those records were presumptively public, you could figure out, using artificial intelligence, you could figure out how to take a past performance report from those records. So this issue of the transaction costs involved in generating these types of reports would just drop away because the records would be publicly available. Not only could the agency access it, but members of the public or competitors could access it as well and serve as a way of correcting it. Do you think that we can, I don't want to put you on the spot in terms of the MPC. Do you think that in general, in the state and local government contracting community, there would be support for an open data approach?
Here's what I can tell you. Before I came to work here, so Keith may be able to add a little bit to this. We had a state engineer who was our chief procurement officer for construction, the previous one to the one who now holds that position. And he required agencies to submit a contractor evaluation form at the completion of every construction project over $10 million. Doesn't seem like such a heavy lift. The resistance to that was overwhelming, such that we no longer require it. What we are trying to do, I think I mentioned to you, Keith and I have been consumed with trying to structure this IT services mega contract, IDIQ stuff. What we are trying to do there is to require performance evaluations at the conclusion of each task order, so that there is a record, so that anyone can look back and see what the evaluation or the grade was that this particular contract holder got for the work that he did. And we also, as part of the 2019 revision to our code, I think one of the things that we did, we created immunities for procurement people who make certain reporting so long as it is done in good faith. Because a lot of people, I was a little surprised. I did not work in government until 10 or 12 years ago. I was very surprised to hear procurement staff who were afraid to say anything bad about a contractor because the contractor might sue them. And that was the driving force behind this good faith immunity provisions that we enacted in 2019. And I think between that and between a growing recognition in the procurement community that, we really do need some way to figure out if Joe did a decent job when he worked for the Department of Redundancy department over here, so that we can make an intelligent decision whether we think that he poses too much of a performance risk for us to give him a contract. So there's hope.
Well, in turning the corner, part of the thing too with the open data is that if you are taking literally all information from a project, you start moving towards the reports you've been talking about, Dixon, are reports from the vantage point of the officials. If you really are absorbing all the information from a project, logically and ideally, you also want to take in user data. How do users respond? Not only taking the contracting officers evaluation on a janitorial contact, but when you leave a restroom, you can hit the smiley face green or yellow or red, taking that data as well as you're evaluating the janitorial contractor. So we're at the breaking point. Why don't we go ahead and take a break I'm just going to turn off the camera. We'll take a break for 10 minutes and then we'll come back. Dixon, thank you very much for a very productive first hour. See you at 10 past the hour. So it's a special surprise for you, Dixon. Your boss can join us. Welcome, Keith. Thanks very much for joining us. So for those who don't know him, Keith McCook has done a lot of very important work in the ABA over the years. Keith, what's your title now in South Carolina?
I'm really just the head lawyer for the procurement shop.
But Keith has been very instrumental in helping push forward the MPC reform initiative. I'm very grateful for that. And he's on a recurring basis. Keith has really emphasized within the public contract law section that we should be thinking about state procurement issues and state and local procurement issues as we move forward. So I'm delighted that he can join us here this evening. So what I'd like to talk about during the second hour, some of the other areas of reform beyond the OMB guidance. And I'm going to be drawing on several different sources. One is that on the fourth session, we're going to have Brandon Hancock and Jacob Berkowitz, who are my research assistants, and we'll have somebody from the state RAMP organization talking about different approaches to cybersecurity. Brandon and Jacob have been doing a lot of research on cybersecurity requirements and cybersecurity initiatives at the state level. They'll be presenting that research so we can get a sort of a snapshot of how the states are dealing with cybersecurity issues. And we'll be learning about how the state RAMP provides a comprehensive type of solution for state government. So cybersecurity will be another area of potential reform. The way that I see, and then Dixon, I'd welcome your views on this. The way I see the reform process really might well move forward in two basic steps. The first step would be addressing the OMB guidance, making sure that the MPC conforms to the OMB guidance. And then there might be a second wave looking at everything else, including potentially cybersecurity. How do you feel about that?
I agree. I was thinking about this afternoon, well, if that's what we do, and if we, if we achieve, say, an early win and have a consensus on, okay, well, here's what we need to give people so that they're in compliance with the OMB guidance if they adopt these things. There's nothing that says that we couldn't publish just that, either as part of the working website, the work product that is posted on the website that may or may not exist at some point, and then move on to these other things, because barely a day goes by in my work that I don't surface another problem, right? The services indefinite task order contracting for services is, just the latest and maybe the biggest. But every day something happens that, oh gosh, how are we going to deal with that? Is this something that requires a legislative or a regulatory solution? Or is this something that we can deal with by revising contract language? And so, yeah, there are certainly issues beyond compliance with the OMB guidance that I'm sure I'm not the only one that thinks that we need to figure out what we're going to do about it, whether it's some change in the model code, whether it's a revision to a regulation, some of the model regulations, whether it's some alternate text to one of the model code provisions, which there are lots of those in the current version of the code, or whether it's something that maybe just stays in the reporter's comments, so that the next man up can see that, yeah, we thought about this, but we couldn't figure out exactly the best way to address it. But yes, there are without question, areas that could use reform or revision beyond simply compliance with the OMB guidance.
So to that point, and Keith, I wanted to ask you, because you've been tracking the MPC process for a long time. Up to and including the 2000 version of the MPC, Keith, the idea was to pull everything together in a book, and then you'd sell the book. The ABA would sell the book for $40 or $45. Technology's changed, and so there may be a much more diverse array of best practices available through the Perspective website. Does that technology, Keith, the change in technology, does that change the nature of what the MPC becomes? Does it become more of a living, breathing, transforming document over time? I'm sorry, you're on mute, Keith.
Thanks, Chris. I think there is room for a more robust and ongoing conversation. The pace of change in society has increased, and there a forum for that where people could address ideas and discuss them and come up with model language that is perhaps not yet tested, but would be a tool for collaboration among governments would be excellent. So, for example, there was a lot of interest for quite some time in reverse auctions. Now, NASPO did a lot of conversation amongst the chief procurement officers a number of years back, and I think many state procurement officials concluded that at the end of the day, the benefits of reverse auctions were less significant than they might have seemed at first blush. But there was no model law on it. There wasn't even a conversation about a model approach to doing it. I would have welcomed at that time a white paper, something that reflected a discussion, a starting point for discussion about how to solve it. What the Model Code Committee and the ABA and the institutions that will ultimately be behind any revision effort decide to do will be a group decision, and I'll be on board with it. But I think my own view is that there is a place for tried and true best practices that we can use as something of a standard. And so much of it doesn't have to be controversial. I think when we get to changing, if and when there are changes to the bid protest sections, there will be an enormous amount of infighting is not the right word, but very different views, and it will get heated. But for example, a basic rule across the country is the material change doctrine. I spent the first several years of my practice, longer than many state procurement lawyers even stay in procurement for the government, before I was aware of a material change doctrine. Why not have a simple codification of such a basic principle? There are basic principles of price analysis and cost reasonableness that would really help provide a touchstone, but they're not necessarily cutting edge. So I think that there's a place for both. There certainly needs to be some discussion, and there's so many topics that whether we can find universal common ground or whether we need a starting point for a larger conversation than in a model law, we need a place for that. For example, inherently governmental function. The federal government has a useful framework for that. I would love to have that conversation. I'm not sure at the state level and at the local level we're ripe to develop a model rule on it. We'll see what comes out of the effort, but it would be great to have these ideas that bubble up in the course of the Model Code project that do not ultimately find themselves in the code, to have a home where the value of that discussion, debate, and those ideas aren't lost. So yes, the technology is a great way to facilitate that.
Yeah, the reverse auctions is a great example. The OECD did a study of what the Mexican government did with reverse auctions. The Mexican government was facing what they alleged was a criminal cartel among coal transporters. They would never bring the price of coal below $100 a ton. And so the Mexican government, they used reverse auctions only twice. They broke the back of this alleged cartel, bringing it below $30 a ton by using reverse auctions. And you can, the OECD published the data. You can see all of a sudden the cartel just broke because somebody wanted to went below the reserve price and ended up below $30 a ton. But the Mexican government didn't use reverse auctions infinitely. They used it twice in order to get a new price benchmark in that marketplace. So having a tool like that available, we want to use reverse auctions because we're in this box. We don't want to use reverse auctions for everything because, like, for example, the nation of Georgia tried to use reverse auctions for everything. Not a good idea. Entire agencies left the procurement regime because they couldn't work in a reverse auction environment. Like, you wouldn't want to buy surgery. Surgical services using reverse auctions. One of our students actually did. It was very funny. One of our students was buying surgical services in the Air Force through reverse auctions, and all the other students moved away from her because it was so dangerous. So yeah, you wouldn't want to use it all the time, but you want to have these kinds of tools available. And if we could use the website as a repository for these kinds of tools, I think that would be very, very useful. So I want to talk a little, and Keith actually saw this presentation with us. In 2013, our students wrote a series of papers on potential reforms of the Model Procurement Code, and they went out, 5 of them went out and presented their papers out in San Francisco to the annual meeting. And the leadership was so impressed that the leadership actually paid the travel expenses of the students, so because they'd paid their own expenses to come out to San Francisco. I briefed them beforehand. We practiced their presentations, and then 5 of them presented. I have to say that the funny thing about it, I'm friends with many of these students still. I had their pictures in here from 2013, but they looked so young in these pictures. I thought I would embarrass them, so I took the pictures out of these of the records. But so Alan Coleman suggested that the MPC should be reformed, and he's writing in 2013 before the OMB guidance that calls for organizational conflict of interest has been published. It was kind of like he foresaw it, and he said that the Model Procurement Code should be revised in order to address various corruption and fraud issues. Do you think, for both of you on this, do you think that the Model Procurement Code could be the home for something like the False Claims Act, the Federal False Claims Act, which so many states now have anyway because of the requirements for Medicaid funding? They have many False Claims Act. Do you think it would be possible or worthwhile to bring the False Claims Act into the Model Procurement Code at the very least, so that more local governments would adopt it as well?
Well, Dixon, if you're not going to take that one, I'll offer some low-hanging fruit. I think that topic, for reasons I don't fully understand, is far more controversial than I understand. We have had a very senior legislator in the Senate introduce now it's probably been a few years since I saw one, but shortly after the federal government came down with a financial incentive to adopt the False Claims Act at the state level, and you probably know more about the details of that financial incentive than I do, but we got additional reimbursement under one of the federal grant programs, so the maybe Medicaid or Medicare. In any event, it got introduced year after year after year and never moved. A clear signal had been sent. That's not going to happen in South Carolina. I understand from a number of years back when I was still looking at it and trying to respond to that legislation that there were I don't know what percentage of the states, but it was a high percentage of the states that weren't moving on it, despite the federal carrot. So I don't know why. I do think that there are challenges for state governments in doing it. I personally think it's a great idea. But it's one of the conversations that you and Dixon had when Dixon was he did the lion's share of the work in South Carolina on trying to adapt the lessons from the federal government on organizational conflicts of interest to something we could manage at the state level, which is a theme both of you talked about earlier, which is trying to right size federal frameworks for something that the states can digest. And I hope throughout this entire model code project, the Dixon theme talked about which is the staffing challenges, we keep in clear focus. And I think that there's a similar challenge associated with the False Claims Act, because the relationships among the federal government players that support the False Claims Act may have a different reality at the state level. So, for example, at the state level, we have the entire management of main central contracts at a central contracting office. It's not at each agency. And the relationship between them and the Department of Justice or the Attorney General's office in each state varies wildly. The False Claims Act was written around a very well-established relationship between DOJ and the rest of the government. So I felt like we needed to make significant changes to the model version that the federal government put out for adoption by the states, for it to actually work in the context of state government with a central purchasing office. So is that right for the model code? I don't know, but I think it's worthy of a discussion, and I would very much like to see how people who understand this, certainly better than I do because we don't have one, would answer the questions about how we adapt it. And so for me personally, that may not be the one that I am most interested in advocating we build into the model, but whether what lines in the model is a much bigger audience to make that decision. But the conversation would be useful because there are a lot of states doing it based on that federal carrot, and there's a lot of good to be had for it.
Jack Basie, who passed away very recently. Jack was really the dean of on the defense side of the False Claims Act bar. And Jack wrote the treatise, the main treatise on the False Claims Act. And Jack, while he was a defense lawyer for his entire career, most of his career, he was in the Justice Department first. But Jack and I agreed on this, that if you look around the world, and most nations around the world don't have an effective fraud statute in the procurement space. And like if you're driving in Mongolia, you're driving along and all of a sudden the road just disappears. There are significant performance issues around the world that could be made better with a good fraud statute. And so Jack and I agreed on this, that even though he was on the defense side, he thought it was a good idea, that the False Claims Act was a good idea. And he really thought it would be a very good idea for the United States to evangelize around it, to really try to get other nations to adopt False Claims Act. And in many ways, we're bringing that question home here for the states that would be implementing it. At the very least, Keith, because the False Claims Act has three basic components. One is very high penalties. The second is a highly incentivized whistleblower. The relator recovers part of it. And then the third thing is a very low, and this was clarified in the recent Supreme Court decision that made clear that the recklessness standard is proceeding in the face of a known risk. So that a defendant under the Civil False Claims Act will be found liable if the company, the contractor, is proceeding in the face of a known risk. That makes contractors more conservative. It means that contractor management has to be more conservative. Well, normally a company is risk embracing. A government contractor facing potential liability under the False Claims Act, or in this case under the mini False Claims Act in South Carolina, has to be more conservative in its management. Is that a problem, Keith? Is that something we should be thinking about in the MPC? Well, if you put a False Claims Act here, it means that government contractors actually have to act more conservatively, in a more risk-averse manner than a normal private company would. Is that you think that's part of the concern, Keith? Is that something we should be thinking about?
I'll answer that in two ways. One harkens back to the commercial products, or the COTS effort that Dixon referenced that South Carolina had made, and the other is about the state context. I have met a number of legislators in South Carolina, some of them in the more senior positions, who are government contractors themselves. So the idea of the government making it easier to prosecute false claims and making the threshold for a claim being false lower may be well, you can see the issue. The other is, one of the things that we did that Dixon didn't get to, but I'll add to what he made a comment about earlier. When we adopted the concept of COTS for the first time, which was Dixon's idea, and it was a great one in South Carolina in 09, when was it 2019, I think, when we last amended the code. Not only did we raise the purchasing threshold for commercial off-the-shelf items for the point that was made earlier, because there's market data on the pricing, but we also took a whole host of socioeconomic rules, such as many states have adopted a rule that says you cannot, in effect, boycott Israel. There are a number of states that have adopted illegal immigration laws that have a procurement component. The list goes on, and every state's got their own flavor. Well, administering those laws to contracts at $100,000 or less is very complicated. The three dealers that are going to sell us, who are going to bid on a purchase order for 2 tractor trailers or for 3 backhoes, do not have the resources to even understand many of the rules in the state procurement system, or to understand what they're signing up for with anti-illegal immigration law. So just taking those off the plate, well, that is in effect the same issue. At some point, we're dealing with a group of contractors that do not have the resources, even of what would qualify as a small business at the federal level. So there's no resources to appreciate the whole overlay of a False Claims Act. So I think that both of those counter in favor of not do we do it or not, because I think there's great value in it, but how do we adapt it and make it workable at the state level?
I just want to quickly ask you, Dixon, about the ethics issues. You raised before that you said South Carolina has an ethics code. It's a little mushy under the Model Procurement Code, but the federal scheme is actually relatively straightforward, where you have normal ethics rules that apply to all government employees, all federal employees, and then you have an additional layer under the Procurement Integrity Act. So, for example, in the normal ethics rules, if you're a federal employee and you're a senior procurement official, if I approach you about a potential job with my company, boom, we violated the Procurement Integrity Act, because it's an additional layer of rules. Whereas if you're a normal government employee, I actually have to negotiate with you in order to trigger recusal requirements. And so you have this additional layer of requirements that have been added on top. How would you feel, Dixon, as the reporter, when you're putting together this revised code, would it make sense to take that layer cake approach and say, what we're really talking about here in the MPC is something on top of a normal ethics code that applies especially to procurement because of the higher risks of procurement?
Our Ethics Act does speak to people who are employees who are empowered to award contracts, and so since I've never worked with Article 12, I'm not sure that I've even read Article 12 of the Model Code, because we have the Ethics Act. My comment earlier was, we don't have anything that addresses the issues on the contractor side. Now, maybe the False Claims Act would be a first step. I think, though, that politically it's problematic. But something like a contractor code of conduct, or I think later on you talk about contractor compliance code. But all of these things, one of my notes on OCI is and it's another resource issue. We had a contractor with a clear organizational conflict of interest. And we told that contractor that he was not going to be able to bid on that. Well, he lawyered up. The lawyer came forward with this very elaborate OCI mitigation plan. And we had never seen one of those before. I understand that there are plenty of them out in the wild, but none of them had made their way into South Carolina. And so we looked at it and we realized that we had 3 choices. Either we rely entirely on the contractor to monitor and police its compliance with the mitigation plan, or we say, nah, we're still not going to let you bid, or we hire somebody almost full time to do nothing more than evaluate the contractor's compliance with the mitigation plan. I think you may have the same sort of issues with a contractor code of conduct and a contractor compliance program. It's wonderful to say, oh, look, we were requiring all of our contractors to abide by this code of conduct, and they have to make reports to us. Well, a little difficult to verify.
Monitor, yeah. What was interesting is that the OECD published earlier this year, Dixon, a paper on risk mitigation and public procurement. When in my world, in my professor world, it's kind of weird because we have a group of cousins that are called public procurement professors, and then we have a group of cousins who are supply chain professors. And we talked during the pandemic because the world was going to hell, so we were exchanging ideas like crazy during the pandemic. But by and large, the two groups of cousins don't talk to each other. But in the supply chain world, in the private supply chain world, it's all about risk. That's what they focus on all the time. And what the OECD was trying to do was port those ideas about risk mitigation into public procurement, which has a lot of ramifications. For example, among other things, it makes us rethink the really clunky administrative mechanisms that we have, which are actually risk mitigation mechanisms, but sometimes they come from the Middle Ages. So they're not very good at risk mitigation. So we have to think about, okay, if the real goal is risk mitigation, then are we using the right processes? But importantly, too, the OECD said risk mitigation has basic steps, which is you have to have a scanning mechanism, you have to then identify risks, you have to mitigate the risks, and then you have to monitor your efforts to address the risk. It's just classic risk mitigation. And when you look at the world, to like a compliance system, Dixon, suddenly makes sense in that context. It is a risk mitigation mechanism for legal risk. It's that's what it is. You could use it for bribery, or you could use it for organizational conflicts of interest. The step that you're focusing on is the last step in the OECD analysis, which is the monitoring question. How do you monitor to make sure that you, in fact, mitigate successfully and will continue to mitigate? Or up front, how would you scan for it? And I got to say, the federal government hasn't done this perfectly. Then the federal government compliance plans are delivered after award, or they may not be delivered at all because the contractor forgets. It's not really taken seriously. But this goes back to the question of open data, Dixon. Once the procurement system, and at the federal level, the statutory requirements, and it could well be that in the next iteration of the OMB guidance, there will be requirements for open data. Presumptively, all the procurement data having to do with federal grants has to be public. When you have that, then you have cross-cutting monitoring. You have monitoring by third parties, by competitors, by civil society, looking at what's going on, and solves your monitoring problem. I hear you that you're hiring a monitor is incredibly expensive to be that OCI monitor, even if you shift the cost to the contractor, because the contractor ultimately will shift that cost back to you in future pricing. But you could use the data systems as they become more sophisticated and start solving that monitoring problem. Alrighty, I want to just talk a little bit, because we're relatively short on time. I want to talk a little bit about the OCI issues, which are going to be important. So the OMB guidance says that if you have a parent, if you're a non-federal entity, you have a parent that is not a state or local government or an Indian tribe, you have to worry about organizational conflicts of interest. You guys have done some really interesting work in South Carolina on OCIs. And I'm going to be including those materials on the program page before Thursday. Did you do it because of the requirement? Excuse me, the requirement of the OMB guidance? Why did you guys spend so much effort on OCIs? Is it just to drive Dixon crazy?
Well, I'm sure that was part of it. I still get hazed. There's no data that supports this, but Keith and I both share a very firm belief that our state loses millions of dollars a year because of organizational conflicts of interest. And so when we revised our code 4 years ago, one of the things that we did was to authorize our board to promulgate a regulation addressed at organizational conflicts of interest. And so
let me just ask you, Dixon, why do you think the state is losing millions of dollars? Where's the leakage?
So an agency hires a consultant to develop a scope of work. And after it reviews the work product, it convinces itself somehow that consultant is probably the only one capable of performing that work. And so they, instead of conducting a procurement, instead of conducting a competitive procurement, they issue a sole source contract. Well, how many millions of dollars could we have saved had that contract been competed? Who knows? We have routinely contracted for these kinds of services. Yeah, I mean, you might almost call them sourcing support, and then not enforced, not even mentioned in any of the solicitation or contract documents that it might be disqualifying for the subsequent procurement, the procurement based on that stuff. And I am aware of at least one instance where maybe a little overzealousness in our office, not the legal office, but our purchasing office, included in a contract, if you bid on this, then you cannot bid on the follow-on. And near the end of the performance of that contract, they issued a change order that deleted that prohibition. Now, in hindsight, the prohibition never should have been there to begin with. But I'm sure that there are instances where there should have been a prohibition, but there wasn't. The second contract was ultimately the subject of a protest. We denied the protest in part because we felt that I'm not sure that we used this language because this is, 6 or 8 years ago. I'm not sure that we were sophisticated enough to actually look at it in these terms, but because the agency had published everything, the entire work product that the first contractor had created for them, we felt like that it was sufficiently mitigated. This case led to Missy Copeland's publication of an article about how wrong we were to have done that. And Missy enjoys the distinction, at least to my knowledge, of being the only lawyer in South Carolina who was smart enough to recognize an OCI and to bring up a protest because of it. So we've been blissfully unaware of these things for so many years, and I can only speculate how much money we may have been losing from it. And now that we have the regulation, and as we begin to enforce it and to include this in training and in protest decisions and contracting documents, Keith and I both think this is going to be a seismic change in the way our state does business. Whether it's good old boys or whether it's these are my favorite consultants or whatever it is that we're doing now, this I think can make a huge change in the way the state conducts business.
So you started off, Dixon, at the beginning talking about the process for MPC reform, and you said you want to make sure that you have officials at the table who are not just lawyers making the rules up. And that's really, I got to tell you, that's how the discussion over the last we've been talking about this for 5 or 10 years. It's always saying having state procuring officials at the table is going to be important because otherwise it's just lawyers. I actually think you just described why it's so important to have officials there because of their perspective on the dynamic. So give you a concrete example. In 2011, Dan Gordon, then who was the OFPP administrator, he wrote a draft set of OCI rules. They never went anywhere. They were actually finally killed 10 years later by the Biden administration in 2021. If you Google 2011 OCI rules, you'll see what he did. And he would have radically revised the OCI rules because he saw the OCI rules falling into several different classes, but one class would be where a consultant is hired and pulls her punches because she's affiliated with a company that might be regulated, for example. So that's the SAIC case that was litigated a few years ago. The another class of OCIs is where somebody's writing their own specs, which is what you described. Dan got completely focused on the loss of legitimacy to the procurement system. He thought the second class was much more serious because it would undermine the legitimacy of the government, undermine the legitimacy of the procurement system. He never talked about what you just said, which is that you're losing millions of dollars. So this practical experience that state officials will bring to the process and say, this isn't a process, it's a problem of legitimacy, but it's also a problem of millions of dollars. We need to fix it for this practical reason. It's a very important part of the process. I think this is a good illustration of why it is exactly right not to have just lawyers at the table, but to have folks who have practical experience.
You know, I think we may have actually drawn from those 2011, wasn't it a proposed regulation?
It was, and it never went anywhere. The defense.
Well, it did. Yes, it did.
In South Carolina.
Procedures, guidance, and instructions. But because what we said, one of the things that we said in there is that if the only risk that an OCI poses is to the business of the agency or a performance risk, then it can be waived at a certain level. But if the risk that it poses is to the integrity of the procurement system, it can never be waived. And I think I pulled that straight out of that 2011 regulation. In fact, well, Keith and I had a very long discussion about whether, well, you know, we wrote the regulation 4 years ago. We had never seen this before, and we're not quite sure if the regulation will allow us to evaluate things the way that we wrote it in the PGI, where you can waive certain OCI risk, but you can never waive this particular OCI risk, because I think that's exactly what I was reading, what you were just talking about.
Yeah, and Dan, what was most controversial about Dan's is he would have shifted some of the OCI rules from FAR Part 9, which is about contract qualification, to FAR Part 3, which is about corruption. And there's an instinctual reluctance in the procurement community to dealing with it as a corruption issue. There actually is a theoretical framework where the reason that we punish organizational conflicts of interest less than we publish personal conflicts of interest is because by definition, organizational conflicts of interest are transparent. You have many, many parties working these issues. And so the societal monitoring mechanisms work much more effectively with organizational conflicts of interest. Personal conflicts of interest, there's a reason that bribes are always delivered in a paper bag. They're always in a paper bag. It's because bribes are secret. And so you can't monitor them, whereas organizational conflicts of interest, you can monitor them. And from a theoretical standpoint, then you can punish them less severely, keep them in FAR Part 9 as opposed to, and also, Dixon, that by having them over in FAR Part 9 is about contractor qualification, and that's really where a compliance system rests. If the contractor has an effective internal mitigation system, internal cleansing system, that's exactly what you saw in that presentation by the contractor, then you can worry about it less. It's not, and you're really not over in the realm of this is a bad actor, which is what FAR Part 3 anti-corruption provisions about. Okay, because we're very short on time, I just wanted to talk about a couple of other things that were raised. So one is this issue of reverse auctions, and just to flag for you guys and to flag for the listeners, because in many ways this is a first discussion of some of these issues. The reverse auction, the federal government published a proposed reverse auction rule, I think it was February 2022, and it's stalled. It's completely stalled, and I'm not sure why. It was in response to 2 reports from GAO that talked about the need for thinking about reverse auctions, because reverse auctions have been broken, arguably broken in the federal government. This issue has been percolating for 20 years. When I first became a professor in 2002, I held an international conference on this issue of reverse auctions. And David Drapkin, who still teaches with me, he's a buddy of mine. We work on studies together, we teach together. David Drapkin was the head of GSA's procurement function at that point. David Drapkin came over, listened to the conference. He was on the panel, and he said, that's great. He went back and he just squashed the rule. Nothing happened in 2002. So it wasn't until 20 years later, in 2022, we finally have a proposed rule, but the proposed rule hasn't gotten anywhere. Just for your purposes, Dixon, for the purposes of the other reporters, just to be aware of this, the proposed rule, even the proposed rule doesn't go far enough. The proposed rule, importantly, for example, doesn't address quality issues. And it is possible to have a reverse auction that considers both price and quality. It's dangerous because as you have in a reverse auction, as the prices converge in a reverse auction, because they do, that's what happens in a reverse auction, the prices converge as you go along. When the competitors are literally pennies away from each other, having one thing that gives you a special advantage, like a quality advantage, can blow out the whole thing. So one of the people in the marketplace pointed out that they did this, they assessed the quality of the seats in fire trucks being bought by Caribbean Nation, and the Caribbean Nation ended up spending, in effect, hundreds of thousands of dollars for cushy seats, because the cushy seats blew out the reverse auction. That quality, you can see it in price preferences. In the District of Columbia, you get a price preference based on the years of residence. So at one point I was a 20-year resident. I had a huge price preference, and I would have blown out anybody in any competition because in a tight price competition, a small quality criterion, a small quality preference can blow everything out. So complicated issues, but they are not even raised in the federal rule. And that's something that, as the MPC process moves forward and if there's consideration of a reverse auction rule, as Greg Harding suggested back in 2013, then one of the things to consider is how could quality be dealt with effectively. So one of the interesting papers from 2013 was the question of constitutional law, whether or not states have the states have the prerogative of writing their own trade rules, or whether or not the federal government can dictate them. It's kind of interesting because while the federal government asserts to foreign governments that the federal government can control how states handle international trade issues, like having a no Sweden rule, for example, that South Carolina won't buy from the Swedes. In practice, the federal government has done exactly that in the OMB guidance. They told at least the grants recipients that they have to have Buy American preference. Again, this is initial discussions for the committee. This is actually less of an issue than it seems, because at one point I asked the chief trade negotiator for the United States, the U.S. Trade Representatives, she spent years negotiating these things. I said, is there a memo in the federal government somewhere that says that the federal government has control over this area or not? Do the states have a constitutional prerogative to control trade, international trade issues? She said there's no memo. And in the federal government, there's no memo. It doesn't, the issue doesn't exist, okay? There's always a memo. So this issue has never been worked out legally within the federal government. It is instead worked out practically, that if the federal government were to dictate to the states on trade issues, say you have to open your markets absolutely to all the Swedes, then there would be chaos at the state level, because the states are not ready to deal with that dramatic imposition from the outside. They may, under a grants rule, if they're taking grants monies, they might, but in general, there's be chaos. So the practical obstacle to it means that this constitutional issue is largely irrelevant, because practically speaking, if the federal government tried to dictate to the states what to do with regard to international trade without any boundaries, then there would be chaos. Okay, Department for Environmental Issues. This looks like a lefty issue. Oh, we should debar contractors because they're they're breaching environmental rules. It's actually, we are working on this issue with regards to labor violations. And we did a report on this, that there are federal statutes that require that you be automatically debarred for violating labor rules. There are also federal statutes that require that if you violate certain environmental statutes, to be automatically debarred. In practice, what turns out is that the debarments don't occur because there are back doors in the regulations where a vendor can get out and not be automatically debarred. What this actually turns into, really interesting for both of you, is an issue of information access. So there are thousands of labor violations, for example, on the Department of Labor website, but contracting officers and debarring officials don't know how to access that information. So instead of it being a question of automatic, because automatic doesn't occur even though statutes contemplate automatic, the real question is, how do we make that information readily available to contracting officials, to debarring officials? How do we create a data flow? That's the problem. And I think that, Dixon, for your purposes as a reporter, for us thinking about these issues, it's not necessarily how do you require a data flow, but how do we anticipate a data flow? Because that data flow will exist and be much more efficient, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. You can actually, you can hire, if you Google Tenderex, it's a group of really smart economists at the University of Vienna. They're Hungarian. They came from the Central European University, was kicked out of Hungary for political reasons. They're now in Vienna instead. They have a product called Tenderex. They'll produce a report for you in South Carolina that analyzes a given contractor, that looks at that a given contractor across multiple different jurisdictions on how that contractor has been evaluated, but they'll charge you 600 euros to do it. So it's not really a workable tool yet, but it's moving a lot closer. So we talked about the bid protest issues, and we just want to touch a little bit on this IDIQ contract issue. I know you guys are working through IDIQ issues in South Carolina. I'm wondering, so the Europeans largely solved this issue by considering in the federal norm, we have IDIQ contracts, and then we have orders. And because the orders aren't contracts, they don't have the normal protections that you would have for, transparency requirements, competition requirements, all those normal legal requirements that don't attach necessarily to the order. It's the legal requirements are imposed on an ad hoc basis, and it's really a screwy patchwork. So if you have, for instance, IDIQ contracts hosted by GSA are different from multiple award schedule contracts hosted by GSA. They're actually in different parts of the FAR, and they have different legal requirements. What would you think about just taking the European approach and saying, okay, the Europeans say we have framework agreements, and then we have things called framework contracts, which would be our orders, and we're just going to deal with them as contracts. We're going to apply the normal presumptively apply the normal procurement rules to those second stage competitions. What would you think about that?
Well, that's exactly one of the things that we are considering. Unlike the FAR, we can't get around the fact that a task order request, a request for a quote, and the quote itself. I think in the FAR, one of them is specifically defined to not be an offer to contract. Well, we can't do that under our definitions. We define a contract as any agreement, no matter what it's called, that obligates the state to pay and the contractor to furnish supplies, services, IT, construction. So under our statutory scheme, a task order is a contract. Now, what we don't know is, I don't know what the model code provision is, but our bid protest statute, which applies to contract awards over $50,000. Well, if I'm going to award a task order for $150,000, is that protestable? And it's hard for me to think of a reason why it's not. It's a $150,000 public contract. And since one of the reasons that we have a bid protest statute is to permit the prosecution by private attorneys general of actions to enforce the integrity of the competitive system, well, why would we make an exception for a six-figure task order? But I don't know we don't know where our client is headed with that. I don't think our client is ready to say, okay, you can protest any task order over $50,000.
No, I think this is a perfect place to close. We're out of time, and I think therefore for Keith and I have been talking about this for over 10 years. How would the MPC revision process work? I think this is an excellent example. I think certainly my experience from the UN model law, the revision process, the key is to identify an issue, to crystallize a simple solution, a very straightforward way of understanding that problem, like we did here. You're dealing, Dixon, with orders as contracts. You're dealing with them interchangeably. Come up with a simple answer, and then have a response from the community saying, you know what, that's logically elegant, but it is not practically workable. And then go forward from there. That's exactly what happened in the United Nations Model Procurement Law. It makes things a little bit murkier, a little messier, but you end up at the end of the day with a much better law. But those first two steps, which is identify the problem based on common experience, and then identify what would be the simplest, most logical solution, and then work from there to the ultimate law. I think that's the only way to make this process overall workable. So thank you, Dixon, for illustrating what Keith and I have been talking about for many, many years. Okay. Any final comments, gentlemen? Thank you to everyone for joining. We've had some steady participation through here. I've been very, very grateful for that. Again, we're going to meet at 6 o'clock Eastern time on Thursday. We're going to be talking about the OMB guidance for grantees, because that's a stepping stone to understanding what may well be the first tranche, the first phase of work under the ABA Model Procurement Code revision. Thank you all, gentlemen, and have a very, very good evening. Take care.
Thanks, Chris.
Bye. Bye.